At 0630 hours on April 7, 1944, Staff Sergeant Roy Matsumoto pressed his face into the damp jungle mud on a hillside called NHPMGA in northern Burma, listening intently to Japanese soldiers just 30 feet away as they discussed how they would kill him and every American on that hill by sunrise. The Japanese were unaware of Matsumoto's presence. They did not know he understood every word they uttered, nor did they realize that the intelligence he was collecting in that instant would turn their own assault into a massacre. Matsumoto was one of roughly 600 American soldiers trapped on that hilltop. They had been besieged for 9 days. Their water supply had been severed. Artillery and mortar fire had carved deep craters into the earth surrounding them. Decomposing Japanese bodies littered the perimeter, rotting in the tropical heat and filling the air with a stench so overpowering that survivors would later nickname the site Maggot Hill. These Americans were Merrill's Marauders, and the Japanese forces encircling them belonged to the 18th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, the same unit that had conquered Singapore and Malaya 2 years earlier. The division had humiliated the British Empire and captured over 80,000 prisoners in the largest military surrender in British history. The 18th Division had never been defeated, neither in China, nor in Malaya, nor in Burma. Its soldiers were jungle warfare experts, veterans of campaigns across Asia, and they outnumbered the Marauders almost 4-1. What transpired over the next 12 hours would redefine everything the Japanese believed about fighting Americans in the jungle. It would also be only one of 35 engagements where this ragged, disease-ridden band of American volunteers would triumph over the conquerors of Singapore. The story of Merrill's Marauders begins with a promise that should never have been made. In August 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met in Quebec to discuss the war in Asia. Japan controlled Burma completely. The Burma Road, the vital supply route to China, had been cut off. China was being strangled. The Allied leaders agreed that an American ground unit should be established to operate behind Japanese lines in Burma. This unit would disrupt enemy supply lines, sever communications, and create chaos in the Japanese rear while Chinese divisions attacked from the front. Roosevelt issued a call for volunteers. The mission, he stated, would be perilous and hazardous. Those were the only details provided. Roughly 3,000 American soldiers responded. They came from jungle training bases in Panama and Trinidad. They came from the brutal campaigns of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and New Georgia. Some came from stateside units hungry for combat. Others came from military stockades, trading prison sentences for a chance at redemption. What united them all was a promise. The Army assured the mission would last approximately 90 days. After that, they would be rotated home, 3 months of combat behind enemy lines, then relief. It was a promise the Army never intended to honor. The volunteers assembled in India in late 1943. They were designated the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, codenamed Galahad. The official name meant nothing to them, nor did the code name. What stuck was the nickname given by war correspondents who visited their training camp. Named after their commander, Brigadier General Frank Merrill, they became Merrill's Marauders. Frank Merrill was 40 years old, a West Point graduate who had studied Japanese language and culture while serving as a military attaché in Tokyo prior to the war. He spoke Japanese fluently and understood the enemy better than almost any American officer in the theater. Yet Merrill had never commanded troops in combat. He was a staff officer, not a field leader. The true architect of the Marauders was Colonel Charles Hunter. Hunter had trained the men, organized their battalions, and prepared them for jungle warfare. He expected to lead them in combat, but General Joseph Stilwell, the American commander in the China-Burma-India theater, appointed Merrill over him. Hunter was demoted to second-in-command. The men felt the injustice. They respected Hunter. They barely knew Merrill, yet orders were orders. On February 24, 1944, 2,750 Marauders crossed into Burma. They were organized into 3 battalions, each divided into 2 combat teams. Red and white belonged to the 1st Battalion, blue and green to the 2nd, orange and khaki to the 3rd. 6 combat teams, roughly 400 men each. No artillery, no tanks, no air support beyond occasional supply drops. Their weapons were limited to what they could carry: M1 rifles, Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, 60mm mortars, bazookas, and mules. 360 mules transported ammunition, radios, and essential supplies through terrain inaccessible to vehicles. Ahead lay the Japanese 18th Division. Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka commanded it. He had previously served as chief of the Military Operations Section at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, one of the most influential positions in the Japanese Army. He was a strategist, a planner, and a believer in Japan's destiny to dominate Asia. His 18th Division had a storied history. Formed in 1907, the division had fought in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, participating in the capture of Nanjing in 1937. Its defining moment came in December 1941, joining Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army for the invasion of Malaya. The Malayan campaign was a masterpiece of speed and audacity. Japanese forces landed on the northeastern coast and advanced south through jungle terrain the British deemed impassable. They used bicycles to move infantry where vehicles could not traverse. They repeatedly outflanked British defensive positions, appearing where the defenders never expected. The 18th Division landed at Kotabaru and advanced down the eastern coast of Malaya, capturing airfields, supply depots, and key defensive positions. When British forces attempted a defensive line, the Japanese flowed around it like water. Singapore, deemed the Gibraltar of the East by Winston Churchill, was supposed to be impregnable. Coastal guns pointed seawards, designed to repel naval attacks. But the Japanese advanced overland across the Johor Strait, attacking from a direction the British had never adequately defended. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore to Yamashita. Over 80,000 British, Australian, Indian, and Malay soldiers became prisoners of war, marking the largest surrender in British military history. The 18th Division earned the nickname Conquerors of Singapore. Its soldiers called themselves the Chrysanthemum Division after the imperial flower of Japan and wore their record with fierce pride. They had humiliated the British Empire and proved that Asian soldiers could defeat European armies in the jungle. After Singapore, the division was transferred to Burma, chasing remaining British forces into India and securing the Vukang Valley, blocking Allied attempts to rebuild a road connecting India to China. Tanaka's mission was defensive: hold the valley, stop the Ledo Road, and destroy any force attempting to advance through his territory. He commanded roughly 7,000 seasoned soldiers, veterans of campaigns across Asia, experts in jungle warfare. No American infantry unit had ever faced the 18th Division. Tanaka saw no reason for concern. Americans were soft, reliant on machines and firepower. They could not survive in the jungle. He was about to discover how mistaken he was. The Marauders did not confront the Japanese head-on. That would have been suicide. They lacked heavy weapons, armor, or numerical superiority. Instead, they emulated a tactic the Japanese had perfected in Malaya. They outflanked the enemy. They moved through jungles so dense the sun barely penetrated, crossed rivers, scaled mountains, and appeared where the Japanese least expected. Their first target was Wabam, a small village serving as a supply depot for the 18th Division. General Stilwell ordered the Marauders to establish a roadblock south of the village, cutting off the Japanese escape route while Chinese divisions attacked from the north. The march to Wallaboom took 8 days. The men hacked through bamboo thicket and waded through chest-deep streams. They climbed ridges so steep that mules slipped and fell to their deaths. Heat and humidity sapped their strength. Leeches covered their legs. Dysentery was already spreading through the ranks. The jungle itself was an enemy. Bamboo thickets grew so dense that machetes bounced off the stalks. Wait a minute. Vines snagged equipment and tripped soldiers who tried to move quietly. The undergrowth harbored snakes, including kraits and cobras whose bites could kill within hours if antivenom was not available. The sounds of the jungle were disorienting. Birds screeched without warning. Monkeys crashed through the canopy above. Every noise could be an enemy patrol. Every shadow could conceal an ambush, but they had advantages the Japanese did not expect. Kachin tribesmen served as their guides and scouts. The Kachin people had suffered terribly under Japanese occupation. Their villages had been burned. Their families had been tortured and killed. Women had been raped. Men had been executed for the slightest resistance. They hated the Japanese with a fury that made them invaluable allies. The Kachin were mountain people indigenous to the highlands of northern Burma. They knew trails that did not appear on any map, paths that even the British colonial administrators had never charted. They could move through the jungle silently, detecting enemy presence by signs invisible to American eyes. The Office of Strategic Services had established Detachment 101 in Burma, recruiting and arming Kachin guerrillas to fight behind Japanese lines. These Kachin Rangers had been ambushing Japanese patrols, sabotaging supply lines, and gathering intelligence for months before the Marauders arrived. When the Marauders entered Burma, Kachin scouts attached to each battalion. They led the Americans along trails that bypassed Japanese outposts. They warned of enemy patrols, sometimes hours before contact could occur. They identified safe water sources and suitable campsites. One Kachin leader, Xing Tong Na, became particularly important to the Marauders. He led groups of scouts who ranged far ahead of the American columns, mapping Japanese positions and identifying gaps in the enemy's defensive lines. The Kachins asked for little in return: weapons, ammunition, the promise that the Americans would help liberate their homeland. They received the first two. The third was a debt that history has never fully repaid. Without the Kachin scouts, the Marauders would have been blind in the jungle. With them, they could see where the Japanese could not, and there was another asset the Japanese never suspected. 14 Japanese American soldiers served with the Marauders as translators and intelligence specialists. These Nisei soldiers, second-generation Americans whose parents had immigrated from Japan, spoke the enemy's language fluently. Their presence in the unit was both remarkable and deeply troubling to consider. These men were Americans. They had been born in California, Hawaii, and other states. They had grown up playing baseball and going to American schools. And when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, their own government had declared them potential enemies. Executive Order 90066, signed by President Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the forced relocation of roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Men, women, and children were sent to internment camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. They lost their homes, their businesses, and their freedom, not because of anything they had done, but because of their ancestry. From behind that barbed wire, some of them volunteered to fight for the country that had imprisoned them. One of those volunteers was Roy Matsumoto. Matsumoto was born in Los Angeles in 1913, but his life had taken him across the Pacific and back. When he was 8 years old, his family decided to visit relatives in Japan. The visit stretched into 9 years. Matsumoto attended Japanese schools. He learned to read and write Japanese. He absorbed the culture, the customs, and most importantly for what would come later, the regional dialects. The dialect he knew best was from the Hiroshima region. His family had roots there. When he worked as a delivery boy in California after returning to America, many of his customers were immigrants from Hiroshima Prefecture. He heard their speech patterns daily. He could recognize that accent anywhere. After Pearl Harbor, Matsumoto and his family were first sent to the Santa Anita racetrack, converted into an assembly center. They slept in horse stalls that still smelled of manure. From there, they were transferred to the Jerome internment camp in Arkansas. Matsumoto could have remained bitter. He could have refused to serve a country that treated him like an enemy. Instead, in the fall of 1942, he volunteered for the United States Army. The Army recognized his language skills. He was sent to the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota, where Japanese American soldiers received intensive training in translation, interrogation, and intelligence analysis. Matsumoto graduated at the top of his class. When the call went out for volunteers to join a secret mission in Burma, Matsumoto answered. So did 13 other Nisei soldiers. They knew the risks. If captured by the Japanese, they would be executed as traitors. Their families in Japan, if they had any, would face retaliation. They went anyway. Now, Matsumoto was in the jungle of Burma, using skills learned in Japan to kill Japanese soldiers. It was a contradiction that defined the experience of thousands of Japanese Americans who served in the war. Their loyalty was questioned by their own government. They proved it on battlefields from Europe to the Pacific. On March 3, 1944, the Marauders reached their blocking positions near Walbom. 3rd Battalion set up south of the village, digging in along the main road. 2nd Battalion took positions to the east. The trap was set. Then, Matsumoto made a discovery that would save hundreds of American lives. While on patrol, he spotted telephone wires strung through the trees. Japanese field communications. Matsumoto borrowed a handset from a signals officer, climbed a tree, and tapped the line. He listened as Japanese soldiers communicated with their headquarters. They spoke in the Hiroshima dialect, the same dialect Matsumoto had learned as a child. Delivering groceries to families from that region in California, he understood everything the Japanese were discussing.
An ammunition dump. Only 3 soldiers were guarding it. They revealed its location. Matsumoto reported the intelligence.
American aircraft bombed the dump. The explosion lit up the
jungle, but the Japanese were not surprised for long.
General Tanaka recognized the threat to his rear and reacted with the speed that had characterized Japanese operations throughout the war. He sent 2 regiments, roughly 4,000 men, to crush the American roadblock. The Battle of Wallaboom lasted 4 days. Japanese infantry attacked the Marauder positions in waves. The Americans held their ground, pouring accurate rifle fire into
the advancing enemy.
Machine guns cut down soldiers who reached the American perimeter.
Mortars dropped shells on Japanese staging areas. The fighting was brutal and intimate.
In the dense jungle, engagements often happened at ranges of less than 50 yards. Soldiers could see the faces of the men they killed. They could hear the screams of the wounded on both sides. The Marauders had one significant advantage in these close-range firefights. Almost every soldier carried a semi-automatic or automatic weapon.
The M1 Garand rifle
could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The Browning automatic rifle provided
devastating suppressive fire. Thompson submachine guns cleared jungle at close quarters. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, carried bolt-action rifles that required them to work the bolt between each shot. In a firefight where
fractions of seconds determined who lived and died, that difference in rate of fire was decisive.
The Japanese also
discovered that American marksmanship exceeded anything they had encountered. The Marauders had trained extensively in what they called jungle lane firing, shooting at pop-up targets and moving silhouettes. They could hit a man-sized target at 100 yards through breaks in the vegetation.
On the second day of the battle,
Japanese forces tried to outflank the American positions, moving through the jungle to attack from an unexpected
direction. A patrol from 1st Battalion spotted them first. The Americans set up an ambush along a small river.
When the Japanese tried to cross, concentrated machine gun fire caught them in the
open. The water ran red. Roughly 100 Japanese soldiers died in that single engagement.
The Marauders discovered something that contradicted everything they had been told about the
Japanese soldier. The enemy was not suicidal. When surrounded, when outflanked, when taking heavy casualties, Japanese soldiers retreated. They did not throw their lives away needlessly.
They fought skillfully, but they could be beaten. General Tanaka himself barely escaped capture.
American
and Chinese forces nearly overran his headquarters. He had to withdraw quickly, leaving behind supplies and
equipment. By March 7, the Japanese withdrew. They left behind roughly 400 to 500 dead.
American casualties were 8 killed and 37 wounded.
The ratio was staggering.
The 18th Division had suffered its first significant defeat in Burma, but the Marauders had no time to celebrate. General Stilwell immediately ordered them to march again.
The promise of 90 days of combat was already forgotten. After Wallaboom, the Marauders moved south toward the town of Shiduzub, and then in Kanga, setting up more roadblocks to cut Japanese supply lines.
The pattern repeated. March through impossible terrain, establish blocking positions, fight off Japanese counterattacks, move again before the enemy could concentrate overwhelming force. At Shiduzub, 1st Battalion established a roadblock that cut the main Japanese supply route. For 3 days, they held against repeated Japanese assaults. When Chinese forces finally arrived to relieve them, they found the jungle around the American positions littered with Japanese dead. At Nkanga, 2nd and 3rd Battalions combined to block another critical road junction. Japanese forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The Marauders held. They always held, but the jungle was killing them as surely as Japanese bullets. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees during the day. Humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion on the march. Those who fell had to be carried or left behind. Malaria spread through the ranks with terrifying speed. The mosquitoes of
Burma carried Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest strain of malaria. Even with
trying tablets which turned the men's skin yellow and caused some to hallucinate, soldiers fell sick by the
dozens. Cerebral malaria killed quickly. Those who survived often relapsed for months or years afterward. Dysentery was even more widespread. Both amoebic and bacillary forms tore through the unit.
Men who could not control their bowels cut holes in the seats of their pants so they could relieve themselves without
stopping.
They called them Burma pants. It was a grim joke that captured the
reality of their existence.
The Americans learned too late that Chinese troops they were coordinating with used
the streams as latrines. The Chinese boiled all their drinking water as a matter of habit.
The Americans trained to rely on halazone purification tablets often drank directly from streams.
The tablets killed bacteria but did nothing against the parasites that caused ebic dysentery.
Men who drank the water
without boiling it fell violently ill. Food was running low.
The rations they carried provided roughly 2,800 calories per day, far less than men burning 6,000 or more calories through constant exertion needed.
The rations were designed for short-term emergency use, not sustained operations. They contained
too little protein and too few vitamins for men engaged in this level of physical activity.
The men grew gaunt. Their uniforms hung loose on shrinking frames, muscles wasted away.
Soldiers who had entered Burma, weighing 180 pounds, found themselves at 140 or less.
They looked like refugees from a famine, not combat infantry. Their feet were rotting. Jungle rot, a fungal infection
that thrived in the constant moisture, ate away at the skin between their toes, and spread across their soles.
Some men could barely walk.
There was no time to dry their feet. There was no dry ground to stand on and still well pushed
them forward.
By late March, the Marauders received orders to move to a village called NHPA. They were to establish a defensive perimeter and hold it against Japanese attack while Chinese divisions continued
their advance. It was a mission that violated everything the unit had been designed for.
The Marauders were a long-range penetration force. They were supposed to strike and withdraw, never holding fixed positions. They had no artillery, no reinforcements, no way to evacuate casualties except by light aircraft.
Landing on jungle clearings, Colonel Hunter protested. General Merrill overruled him.
Orders from Stilwell were absolute.
On March 28, 2nd Battalion reached NHPMGA and began digging in. Within hours, Japanese forces surrounded them. The siege of NHPMGA lasted 11 days.
Roughly 600 Marauders held the hilltop against more
than 2,000 Japanese soldiers. Artillery and mortar fire pounded their positions day and night.
The Japanese had dragged
mountain guns through the jungle to blast the American perimeter. Every hour brought new explosions.
Shells crashed
into foxholes.
Trees shattered, sending splinters of wood through the air like shrapnel. Men learned to judge incoming
rounds by sound.
A high-pitched whistle meant the shell would pass overhead.
A deeper growing roar meant it was coming close.
The single water source, a small stream at the base of the hill, became
the most contested ground in Burma.
The stream changed hands multiple times. Soldiers died trying to fill canteens. Eventually, the Japanese captured it completely and held it.
Men went without water for days.
They collected moisture from leaves at dawn, squeezing the dew into their mouths. They rationed every drop in their canteens, taking tiny sips that did nothing to quench the burning thirst.
Some drank their own urine.
Others licked moisture from rocks.
Dehydration killed as surely as bullets.
Wounded soldiers lay in foxholes, unable to be evacuated.
The light aircraft that had been evacuating casualties could not land under the constant fire. Medical supplies ran low. Surgeons operated without anesthesia.
Morphine was rationed for only the most severe cases. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. The dead could not be buried. There was no safe ground to dig graves.
Japanese fire covered every open space.
Bodies were stacked at the edge of the perimeter, covered with ponchos when ponchos were available.
Japanese bodies
from failed assaults rotted where they fell.
The tropical heat accelerated decomposition.
Within days, the corpses bloated and burst.
Maggots swarmed by the millions.
The stench of death hung over everything, inescapable, overwhelming.
The soldiers who survived NHPMGR would later rename the place. They called it Maggot Hill. The Japanese attacked repeatedly, probing for weakness, trying to find a gap in the American perimeter. Each attack was beaten back. Each attack
left more bodies on the hillside, but the Japanese kept coming.
They had more men. They could afford the losses. The Americans could not.
General Merrill suffered his first heart attack during the siege.
He had to be evacuated, leaving Colonel Hunter in command of the relief operation. 1st and 3rd Battalions were ordered to break through
to the surrounded 2nd Battalion. It was during this siege on the night of April 6 that Roy Matsumoto performed the act that would make him a legend among the Marauders.
On the night of April 6, Japanese preparations for a major assault could be heard throughout the American perimeter. Soldiers were talking, moving
equipment, organizing for an attack, but no one could understand what they were saying.
Matsumoto told his commander, Colonel George MC, that he was going out. MC objected. It was too dangerous. Matsumoto insisted.
He stripped off his helmet, his field jacket, his weapon. Wearing only his undershirt, he crawled down the hillside toward the Japanese lines.
He moved slowly, silently, pressing himself into the mud.
If discovered, he would be killed instantly, and if captured, his fate
would be far worse.
The Japanese showed no mercy to traitors, as they would see a Japanese American fighting against
them. Matsumoto reached a position less than 30 feet from a group of Japanese soldiers. He lay motionless in the darkness, listening.
The soldiers were discussing the morning attack. They would concentrate their assault on a
specific section of the American perimeter. They would attack at dawn. The objective was to break through and annihilate the surrounded Americans. Matsumoto crawled back to the American lines and reported everything. Colonel McGee immediately reorganized the defense.
The Marauders abandoned their forward foxholes, booby-trapping them
with grenades.
They set up new positions on higher ground, concentrating their firepower on the exact approach the
Japanese planned to use. At dawn on April 7, the Japanese attacked. They
charged up the hillside, expecting to find exhausted Americans in their foxholes.
Instead, they found booby traps. Grenades exploded among the leading soldiers. Those who survived pushed forward into a killing zone.
The Marauders opened fire from their new positions.
Every weapon on the line fired at once.
Automatic rifles, machine guns, and carbines poured lead into the
attacking force. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozens. And then Matsumoto did something that bordered on insanity.
He stood up in his foxhole, fully exposed to enemy fire, and shouted in Japanese. He yelled commands in the voice of an officer. He ordered the Japanese soldiers to charge forward to keep
attacking.
The Japanese soldiers heard what they thought was one of their own officers urging them on.
They obeyed.
They ran directly into the American guns.
The slaughter was complete. When the firing stopped, 54 Japanese bodies lay in front of the American positions. 2 Japanese officers were among the dead. American casualties were 0. The siege of NHPGA ended on April 9 when 1st Battalion broke through Japanese
lines to relieve their surrounded comrades.
2nd Battalion emerged from the hilltop looking like ghosts. They
had lost 57 killed and over 300 wounded. Hundreds more were sick with dysentery, malaria, and typhus, but they had held and the Japanese 18th Division had been defeated again.
Roy Matsumoto was recommended for the Medal of Honor.
His commanding officer was asked why he was not receiving it.
The officer replied that Matsumoto was only an enlisted man doing his duty. He received the Legion of Merit instead. Decades later, he would be inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame. After NHPMGA, the Marauders
were physically broken. The unit had lost roughly 700 men to combat and disease since entering Burma.
Many of those still standing could barely walk.
Their uniforms were rotting off their bodies. Their boots had fallen apart.
Almost every man suffered from some form of illness.
The promised 90 days had passed. The men expected to be evacuated to India for rest and recovery.
General Stilwell had other plans. The final objective was Myitkyina, a town in northern Burma with the only all-weather airstrip in the region. Capturing that airfield would transform the Allied supply situation, allowing aircraft to fly directly into Burma instead of making the dangerous journey over the Himalayan mountains. Stilwell ordered the Marauders to march to Myitkyina and seize the airfield. But
the route to Myitkyina crossed some of the most forbidding terrain in Asia.
The Kumen mountain range stood between the
Marauders and their objective, a wall of jungle-covered peaks rising over 6,000 feet. Pilots who flew supplies over the Himalayas called the route the Hump.
Hundreds of American airmen had already died making that journey. Capturing Myitkyina would save lives far beyond the immediate battlefield. Colonel Hunter was stunned. The men were destroyed. They needed rest, medical care, and replacements. He requested that the unit be withdrawn to India. Stilwell was unmoved. The mission would proceed. Hunter's objections were noted and ignored. On April 28, what remained of
the Marauders began the most brutal march of the campaign. They were reinforced by 2 Chinese regiments and
600 Kachin Rangers, but the American infantry would lead the assault.
The monsoon had arrived in full force.
Rain
fell in sheets so thick that men could barely see 10 feet ahead. Trails that had been difficult became impossible.
Mud sucked at boots and swallowed mules whole.
The trails were so narrow that mules carrying supplies slipped and fell
to their deaths.
The animals tumbled down mountainsides, their loads of ammunition and food lost forever.
The
screams of falling mules echoed through the valleys. Men who had grown attached to their animals during months of shared hardship watched helplessly. Men weakened by disease collapsed on the trail and had to be carried.
There were not enough stretcher bearers.
There were not enough stretchers.
Men improvised, slinging sick comrades between poles, dragging them through the mud.
They waded through water up to their waists.
They slept in the mud because there was no dry ground. Fungal infections spread across their bodies.
Scrub typhus, carried by mites in the jungle undergrowth, began killing soldiers who had survived everything else.
Some men marched the final miles barefoot, their boots having disintegrated.
The march to Myitkyina covered roughly 100 kilometers in 17 days. By the time the survivors reached the outskirts of the airfield, the Marauders numbered roughly 1,300 men. Many could barely stand, but they had done what the Japanese believed impossible. They had crossed the Kunming Range during monsoon season.
Captain William Laffin, the intelligence officer for the lead element, scouted the Japanese defenses and confirmed that the garrison was unprepared. They had no
idea an assault force had crossed the mountains. The terrain was supposed to be impossible.
On May 17, 1944, the
Marauders and elements of 2 Chinese regiments attacked the Myitkyina airfield.
Colonel Hunter commanded the assault force.
The attack began at 1,000 hours. By noon, the airfield was in Allied hands. The Japanese garrison of roughly
700 men was caught completely by surprise.
They had expected an attack eventually, but from a different
direction.
The appearance of American soldiers from the north, from across mountains they believed uncrossable,
broke their defensive plans.
The Marauders had accomplished their final objective. General Stilwell flew in the next day with a group of war correspondents to celebrate the victory.
But the celebration was premature.
The town of Myitkyina, 5 miles from the airfield, remained in Japanese hands, and Stilwell, instead of relieving the exhausted Marauders, ordered them to help take the
town.
What was supposed to be a quick mop-up operation became a grinding siege that lasted 2.5 more months. Japanese reinforcements poured into the town through routes the Allies had not blocked.
The garrison eventually grew to
4,600 well-armed defenders, far more than the exhausted Allied force could easily
overcome. The Marauders, reinforced by Chinese troops and hastily assembled replacement units called New Galahad, fought through the monsoon rains.
Trenches filled with water.
Foxholes became swimming pools. The fighting was close and brutal. House to house, room to room.
Men who should have been in hospitals were pulled from their beds in
India and flown back to the front lines. Soldiers with fevers over 103 degrees were ordered to keep fighting. Medical officers protested. Their protests were ignored.
The unit that had entered Burma with 2,750 men was reduced
to a few hundred skeletal survivors.
General Merrill himself collapsed.
He
suffered his second heart attack of the campaign, complicated by a bout of malaria, and had to be evacuated
permanently. Colonel Hunter took command for the final push. On August 3, 1944, Myitkyina finally fell. The Japanese commander, Major General Genzo Mizukami, had committed suicide the day before. Roughly 600 Japanese soldiers escaped across the Irati River. The rest, over 3,800 soldiers were killed or captured. 187 surrendered, an unusually high number for Japanese troops. 1 week later, the 537th Composite Unit Provisional was officially disbanded. Of the roughly 3,000 men who had been assigned to the unit, only 130 were still fit for duty. Only 2 men from the original force had never been hospitalized for wounds or illness. None of the horses survived. Only 41 of the 360 mules made it out alive. In slightly more than 5 months of combat, Merrills Marauders had marched over 750 miles through some of the harshest terrain on Earth. They had fought in 5 major battles: Wabam, Shaduzup, Incheon, Pamanga, and Medkina, and engaged the Japanese in 30 separate actions. In total, 35 engagements against the Conquerors of Singapore. They had defeated the Japanese 18th Division every single time. The Japanese could not understand what had happened. Their after-action reports expressed confusion and frustration. American soldiers were supposed to be soft, undisciplined, unable to withstand the rigors of jungle warfare. That was the conventional wisdom throughout the Imperial Army. The easy conquests of 1941 and 42 had reinforced this belief. Instead, the Marauders had outmatched them, outflanked them, and outfought them at every turn. They had used the jungle as a weapon, just as the Japanese had done against the British. They had accepted suffering that should have broken them. They had fought when rational men would have surrendered. Japanese intelligence tried to understand what made the American force so effective. They noted the Marauders' superior firepower at close range. They noted their willingness to operate for extended periods without resupply. They noted their use of local guides and guerrilla allies. But none of these factors fully explained why the Americans had succeeded where the British had failed. The answer lay in something harder to quantify. The Marauders were volunteers. Every man in the unit had chosen to be there. They had answered a call for a dangerous and hazardous mission when they could have stayed in safer assignments. That self-selection created a unit of exceptional motivation and cohesion. They also fought for each other in ways that transcended normal military discipline. After months of shared suffering, the bonds between soldiers became unbreakable. Men who could barely walk stayed in the line because they would not abandon their comrades. They took one more step, not because of orders from distant generals, but because the soldier beside them was taking one more step. Lieutenant General Tanaka, the commander who had helped conquer Singapore, was transferred to become Chief of Staff of the Burma area Army in September 1944. It was a lateral move that effectively ended his career as a combat commander. His reputation never recovered from the defeats inflicted by the Marauders. The 18th Division itself was shattered. By the end of the Burma campaign, it had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The division that had conquered Malaya in 70 days and accepted the surrender of Singapore had been ground down by American infantry and Chinese troops in the jungles it once dominated. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese soldiers was profound. They had believed themselves invincible in jungle warfare. That belief died in the Hukong Valley and at NHPGA and Makina. The men who escaped Burma carried that knowledge with them. The myth of Japanese supremacy in the jungle had been shattered. British commanders who had been driven out of Burma in 1942 took note of what the Americans had accomplished. The techniques pioneered by the Marauders, long-range penetration, cooperation with indigenous guerrillas, aggressive patrolling behind enemy lines, would inform Allied operations throughout the remainder of the war in Southeast Asia. The 14th Army, which would reconquer Burma in 1945, used many of the lessons learned from the Marauder campaign. The British had suffered their greatest defeat at Singapore. The Americans had shown them how to win. The legacy of what happened in Burma took years to be fully recognized. During the war, the Marauders received a Distinguished Unit citation, the highest honor that could be awarded to a military unit. Every soldier who served with the unit received the Bronze Star, a distinction almost unheard of in the American military. 6 Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded.
for legions of merit, 44 silver stars, but the men
themselves felt betrayed.
The promise of 90 days had been broken.
Stilwell had pushed them until they were destroyed. Hundreds had died not from enemy action, but from disease and exhaustion that could have been prevented with proper rest and medical care.
The War Department had predicted 85% casualties
before the mission even began.
They knew the Marauders were expendable.
They sent
them anyway, and they kept them in combat long after any reasonable commander would have withdrawn them for
recovery.
The survivors carried the physical and psychological scars for the
rest of their lives. Malaria recurred for years, sometimes decades after the war. Big dysentery left permanent damage to digestive systems.
The psychological trauma of what they experienced, watching friends die, fighting while sick, being pushed beyond human
endurance, stayed with them.
Colonel Hunter later wrote a scathing report on the campaign, accusing Stilwell of
misusing the unit and causing unnecessary casualties.
His report described what he called an almost
complete breakdown of morale in the major portion of the unit during the final weeks at Makina.
Men who had volunteered for a dangerous mission, who had fought with extraordinary courage, had been broken by commanders who saw them as numbers on a chart rather than human beings.
Army Inspector General investigation followed. Congressional hearings were held.
The findings were damning, but Stilwell faced no consequences. He was eventually recalled from the theater in October 1944, but for other reasons
related to his conflicts with Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and with
British commanders who found him impossible to work with.
Frank Merrill was promoted to Major General in September 1944.
Even as his health continued to deteriorate, he served briefly as Deputy
Commander of American forces in Burma, then transferred to serve with the 10th Army at Okinawa. His heart never fully recovered from the attacks he suffered in Burma.
He retired from the Army in 1948 and became the
Highway Commissioner of New Hampshire.
He died of a heart attack on December 11, 1955 at age 52.
He had just been
elected president of the American Association of State Highway Officials. The strain of his wartime service had
caught up with him.
Charles Hunter was sent home by slow boat after Makina, a deliberate humiliation for an officer who had questioned Stilwell's orders.
He never received the recognition his
leadership deserved.
He spent the rest of his life advocating for the men he had trained and led. He wrote a book about the campaign called Galahad, telling the story the Army preferred to forget.
Hunter described what he believed was the essential character of the Marauders.
They were not supermen.
They were ordinary soldiers who had volunteered for an extraordinary mission and had given everything they had.
The
secret of their success, he wrote, was not their training or their equipment.
It was their willingness to take one
more step when every fiber of their being screamed for them to stop.
Roy Matsumoto stayed in the Army serving in intelligence roles for 20 more years. He worked in China after the war serving with the Office of Strategic Services. He later served in Japan during the occupation. He retired as a master sergeant in 1963. For decades, Matsumoto
rarely spoke about his service in Burma. His wartime records were classified. The role of the Nisei soldiers in the
Pacific was kept secret for years after the war ended. When asked about his experiences, he would say he was just doing his job.
In 1993, 49 years after NHPMGA,
Matsumoto was inducted into the
Ranger Hall of Fame at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was recognized not just for his actions at NHPMGA, but for his service throughout the campaign. His intelligence work at Wabam, where he discovered the location of the Japanese ammunition dump, had been equally important.
3 other Nisei soldiers from the
Marauders eventually joined him in the Ranger Hall of Fame.
Henry Gosha was inducted in 1997. Grant Hayabayashi in
2004, their service rendered for a country that had questioned their loyalty was finally given the recognition it deserved. The 14 NI who served with the Marauders all survived the campaign, a remarkable fact given the casualty rates among their comrades. General Merrill himself praised them after the war. Regarding the significance of the Nisei group, he stated, "I could not have managed without them. Their contribution extended beyond translation and intelligence collection. They demonstrated that Japanese Americans, despite the prejudice and suspicion they faced, were as loyal and courageous as any soldiers in the United States Army. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was proving the same truth in Europe simultaneously, becoming the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. After the war, the unit was consolidated into the 475th Infantry Regiment, continuing operations in Burma as part of the Mars Task Force until February 1945. When the unit was redesignated in 1954, it became the 75th Infantry, and from that lineage emerged the modern 75th Ranger Regiment. Every Ranger today wears the Marauder patch on their uniform, and the colors of the 6 original combat teams, red, white, blue, green, orange, and khaki, appear on every Ranger beret.
The modern Ranger motto, "Rangers lead the way," embodies the spirit of the men who marched through Burma 8 decades ago. Camp Frank D. Merrill, near Dalanege, Georgia, serves as the training ground for the mountain phase of Army Ranger School.
Every candidate who earns the Ranger tab trains on terrain named for the commander of the Marauders, learning the same skills in endurance, navigation, and small unit tactics that kept the original Marauders alive in the jungle. 30 members of the 5,307th Composite Unit have been inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame, more than any other single World War II unit. In 2020, 76 years after the Burma campaign, Congress passed the Merrills Marauders Congressional Gold Medal Act, officially recognizing the extraordinary service, bravery, and sacrifice of the unit during their 1944 campaign in the China-Burma-India theater.
President Trump signed it into law on October 17, 2020.
The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest civilian award the nation can grant, previously awarded to figures such as George Washington, Thomas Edison, Rosa Parks, and the Tuskegee Airmen. Merrill's Marauders now stand among them.
The medal ceremony was held virtually on May 25, 2022, due to the advanced age of the surviving members. At that time, only a few original Marauders were still living. Russell Hamler and Gabriel Kenny were among those in attendance, with Kenny, the oldest survivor, having just celebrated his 100th birthday. They had waited nearly 8 decades for the recognition they rightfully earned. Most of their comrades never lived to see it. Speaking at the ceremony, Gabriel Kenny said, "For Congress to pass a bill acknowledging our service means a great deal to me and my family. For those members who returned home and passed away without seeing this medal, I hope their descendants take as much pride in it as we do." Army Chief of Staff General James McConville addressed the ceremony, describing what the Marauders represented. They answered the call for the most perilous missions, facing the harshest conditions in the jungles of Burma, and embodying the best of the Army and the nation. Everything they did laid the groundwork for the creation of the modern Army Ranger Regiment.
The Marauders' legacy persists in both visible and invisible ways, visibly in the Ranger Regiment and the Special Operations community tracing its lineage to Burma, and invisibly in the understanding that humans can endure far beyond what they believe possible when fighting for one another. The story of Merrill's Marauders is not only a story of military triumph but of men pushed to human limits who refused to break.
It is a story of promises made and broken by commanders who viewed them as expendable.
It is a story of Japanese-American soldiers serving a country that had imprisoned their families. It is a story of Kachin tribesmen risking everything to aid strangers fighting to liberate their homeland. It is a story of what happens when ordinary men decide the mission matters more than their own survival.
Retired Lieutenant General Sam Wilson, who served with the Marauders and later helped establish Delta Force, reflected years after the war, "We were expendable.
A plan existed on paper to get us into Burma, but none existed to get us out." Winston Churchill described Burma as the most forbidding combat zone imaginable, while General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, called the Burma mission one of the most challenging of the war. Yet the Marauders went, fought, and triumphed. In the jungles of Burma, 3,000 volunteers answered the call for a dangerous mission.
Most returned forever changed, and hundreds never came home at all. But they proved that soldiers could achieve the extraordinary.
They defeated the Conquerors of Singapore 35 times, demonstrating that Japanese soldiers, despite myths of invincibility, could be beaten in their own terrain. They marched farther than any other American infantry unit in the war, became the first U.S. ground force to engage Japanese soldiers on the Asian mainland, and operated behind enemy lines longer than any other formation. They forged a legacy that endures today in the soldiers who wear their patch and carry their name.
Rangers lead.